Let's go ahead and install SQL Server on our local computer. If you are following along from the last movie, you should have this file here in your downloads folder or one similar to it. Mine indicates that I'm going to install in the Community Technology Preview 2.4 version of SQL Server 2019. Yours is probably going to indicate the final release for the developer or the standard edition. Also, while we're here, notice that the file size for this file is pretty small. It's coming in under about 4 megabytes, and that's because the bulk of the download is going to happen as we move through the installation process. Go ahead and double-click on this to start it up, and we do want to allow this program to make changes to our computer. That'll bring us to this step, where we have 3 different options to choose from. The basic option will allow us to quickly install SQL Server by skipping through about 90% or so of the options that we have available and just give us a default configuration. The option over here on the right will simply download the media files to our computer. This can be useful if you're going to be installing SQL Server on multiple computers. That way, you don't have to download the files every time on each computer. The option that I'm going to choose is the custom option. This will allow me to choose the different options that I want to install. When I choose custom, it'll first ask me where I want to store the media it'll download, the installation files. It'll default to this folder right here, which is fine. I'll go ahead and press the install button. That'll download a much larger file. You can see it's about 1.3 gigabytes in size. Depending on your internet connection, this might take a little while to download. When it's done, it'll automatically move us over here to the SQL Server Installation Center. Let me go ahead and clean up my screen real quick. On the left, we have some different tools that we can move through here. It starts us here with the planning step, where we can review some of the documentation for SQL Server. For instance, we can see hardware and software requirements or some security documentation. One of the useful tools that we have here is the System Configuration Checker. Let's go ahead and click on this link to run that. This will run through and check our computer to make sure that we're ready to install SQL Server. You can see that my computer is currently passing, which is great. If your computer fails for any reason, you'll need to address those concerns before you move on to the next steps. Let's go ahead and press the OK button here, and that'll take us right back. When we're done reviewing the documentation that we want, go ahead and switch over to the installation option. This is where we can install a new SQL Server standalone instance or add features to an instance if we've already installed one, or we can install additional components, such as reporting services or management tools. We're going to stick with this first option to install our first standalone installation of SQL Server. That'll bring us to the Setup window, and on the left, we have all the different setup steps that we're going to move through. The first one is to select a product key. If you're using a free edition of SQL Server, you can select it from the drop-down menu. I'm going to switch us over to the Developer Edition. If you're using a paid edition of SQL Server, you'll choose this option and enter in your product key. With mine switched over to Developer, I'll press the Next button. That'll bring us over to the licensing terms, which we can scroll through to read, and when we're ready, go ahead and put a check mark here to accept the license terms and press the Next button. That'll move through a global rule step and then go over here to the Microsoft Update step. I'm going to turn this option on to use Microsoft Update to check for updates, which is the recommended option, and press the Next button. That'll bring us down to the Install Rules step, and we can see we have another check that was performed and we have the results over here on the left. I have 2 good results with a green check mark, and then I have 1 warning for my Windows firewall. If you want to read the status of any of these, just click on the link, and you can see the details here. In my case, the Windows firewall isn't going to cause us any problems, so I'll just accept this as a warning, and we'll move on. I'm just going to press the Next button. Finally, we'll get to define which components we're actually going to install. The main one is the Database Engine Services, so go ahead and place a check mark there. When you click on each of these instance features, you'll notice we get a description over here on the left as to what's about to be installed, as well as any prerequisites for what we've selected. These are all the different things that need to be installed on the computer in order for the feature to work. We have lots of different things that we can install here. For instance, machine learning services will allow us to use the R or Python languages in our SQL scripts if we wanted to. We can also install analysis services, and if I scroll down, we have some different connectivity options as well. I'm just going to leave mine with the very basic installation of just the database engine services, so I'll make sure that that's the only one that I have checked for this course. If you want to install other components, that's fine, just go ahead and make the selections in these checkboxes and we'll move on to the next step. Then we'll get to configure our instance. We can either choose the default instance name of MS SQL Server or we can name our instance. I'm going to choose this option and call it SQL Server 2019. I'll come down to the instance ID, and that'll automatically update to reflect the named instance that I've typed in up above. Then down below, we can see an installation directory where all the files are going to go for my particular instance, and on my computer, that's the C drive, Program Files, Microsoft SQL Server. Then we have this line here that represents the version of SQL Server that we're installing, version 15, and finally a dot, and then our instance name. I'll go ahead and press the next button to move on to the next step. Under a server configuration, we're going to leave all the default options here, but I do want to point out that the SQL Server database engine, its startup type is set to automatic. I'll talk about what this means later on in the course. Go ahead and press the next button. On the database engine configuration screen, we get to define the authentication mode. And this is how we're going to log into our SQL Server instance. The default option is Windows Authentication, which will use our current Windows user account to log into the server. I'm going to actually enable Mixed Mode, which will enable SQL Server authentication as well as Windows Authentication. This will allow me to create users within SQL Server that we can use to log in. That'll automatically enable an account called the System Administrator account, or the SA account. And all we need to do here is type in a new password and confirm the password for the SA account. Make sure that this is a strong password, which means using more than 8 characters, capital and lowercase letters, numbers, and symbols. I also want to make sure that I'm enabling my current Windows login account as an administrator, so I'll press the Add Current User Account to add the line here with my current username. We can also see the name of my computer right here. Let's press the next button to move to the next step. That'll move us down to Ready to Install, where we can review a summary of all the different options that we've chosen. Once you've reviewed this, go ahead and press the Install button. That'll move us down to Installation Progress, and we can watch the status bar slowly crawl across the screen. When it's done, we should see lots of green check marks here, which is great, and the status of succeeded, so everything looks like it worked out well. I'll press the Close button. That'll return us back into the installation center, and we can close this down. And we're now installed with SQL Server on our computer. Let's come down to the Start menu and take a look at what's changed over here. I'm going to scroll down until I get to the M section, and we'll have a new folder called Microsoft SQL Server 2019. And inside of there are a couple of tools we can use. I'm going to use the Configuration Manager a couple of times in this course, so I want to right-click on that and pin it to my Start menu. The other option that's useful here is the SQL Server Installation Center, which, if I click on this, and say yes again, that'll return us right back into where we started. If you ever needed to make changes to your installation of SQL Server, you'll come back to the Installation option, click on this link at the top again, and browse out to your computer to find the installation media that we downloaded in the first process. For me, that was in a folder on my C drive inside of a folder called SQL 2019 CTP 2.4, and then we'll click into the Valuation Edition folder and say OK. It'll find the installation media, and return me right back into the setup process, where it can make any changes. To do that, I would simply choose to add features to an existing instance of SQL Server and make the selection here on the drop-down list. Press the Next button. That'll return me back to the feature selection step, where I can make additional changes by checking on the boxes here and running through that installation process again. But at this point, we have a basic installation of SQL Server up and running on our local computer. Because SQL Server needs to fill a wide variety of use cases, There's lots of these customization options that are available through this installer. If you ever need to install additional components, you'll simply come back to this screen and install them. I'm going to leave my installation the way it was, so I'll go ahead and close out of this and say yes and close down the installation center.